Welcome to today's webinar, Managing Resilience in the Current Climate, with our presenter, Peter Selby. I'm Brendan O'Keefe, New South Wales Chapter President for Australasian Supply Chain Institute. And before I introduce Peter, I'd like to run through some housekeeping for the webinar. Firstly, my apologies. I've got a technical glitch with my video today, so do apologise on that count. First check is to make sure everybody can hear me. And raise your hand if you can hear me using the below buttons. If you are having any technical difficulties, please open your chat box on your screen and send a message. Two other minor housekeeping items in terms of the identification on processes here. Firstly, any polls taken will be anonymous, and we will run a poll prior to presentation by Peter. And secondly, there will be plenty of time for questions during the course of this presentation. The Q&A section is not anonymous, and I'd encourage you to place your questions in the chat box so we can capture these and address them during the course of the presentation, as we're looking to have this quite an active dialogue today. Firstly, I would like to run through some ASCI update slides before we get into the presentations with Peter. So here at the Early Bird and award nominations are open for the ASCI 2021, which is set for February at the William Inglis Hotel here in Sydney. The conference themes you can see across 5 streams, and we have also got award categories. A number of these have been run in previous years, and there's some new ones being added for this coming year, which is Supply Chain Sustainability, Digital Transformations and Supply Chain Leaders Award. We are looking forward to submissions for awards categories, so please, if you're interested, make contact with ASCI and we can manage those nominations. Next slide, please, Monique. So another new development which has come out is the Instructor Development Program and Preferred Training Partner Programs. So these are fantastic opportunities for your organizations to become involved from an APICS perspective. And we've already had some interest in terms of submissions, which is fantastic. So please, you can go to a link which Monique will show as well on that, and make your inquiries, as certainly very worthwhile for your internal organizations and development of your own people. Next slide, please, Monique. So many of you will have probably seen this slide before. Ultimately, there's always a good time to continue your study or development of your study with ASCI. Given what we've been through in the past 6 and 12 months, definitely it's probably as compelling a time as any to look at your various programs and consider the options that are available to you. The 3 key aligned areas are across CPIM, CSCP, and CLTD. Now, there are some discounts at the moment in terms of subscriptions to those. So if you're interested, please head to the ASCI website, make your inquiry, and be more than happy to help in that regard. And in terms of following events from here, next week there's a pharmaceutical supply chain management success in COVID-19. So if you're interested, please register for that, as will certainly be interesting to those, maybe in particular to pharmaceutical, but definitely logistics supply chain organizations. Now, before I run into introduction of Peter more formally, I'd like to just run some polls here. So if you can reply to these, be useful for content for today. What sector are you working in? And then ultimately, and from a subcategory of that, what particular subsector if you're happy to fill that in at the moment. Just waiting through for some results. So we're seeing that there's a majority, just a slight majority across supply chain logistics, with manufacturing, industrial being most represented, and a little bit of retail e-commerce. And then there's a pretty even split actually between, industrial product services 1/3, but all the rest about equivalent rankings. And there's a next poll as well. So in this one, in the past 6 months, has your business seen impacts of COVID-19? And then the second question, has the business demonstrated resilience to work through the COVID-19 challenges? So I'm just waiting for results to come up on that to tally at this point. So resounding changes for everyone, from minor to major. It's split almost 50-50. And then in terms of the second question, again, a similar split of results. So I think absolutely we've all seen the change. We've all been impacted by the change of COVID-19. I think there's a final poll, Monique, or that's finished?
No, that's
so,
Brendan, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So I'd like to now introduce Peter, who's been in marketplace for many years, an experienced business advisor and coach, and allow him to introduce yourself. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for your time today.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity to come here. It's always good to have a chance to talk about what we see going on in the market, and answer any questions people may have. So yeah, no, looking forward to the conversation. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about today is just really observations that we see through the market, and have seen over the last 6 months specifically, as companies try and manage their way through adversity. And interestingly, the survey you just ran there reflects reasonably accurately what we're seeing in the market, and some of the patterns that we're seeing. And now we operate predominantly in Australia, New Zealand, the USA, and the UK. And some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is fairly relevant across all of those markets, even though some of the industries are quite different, or some of the companies are quite different. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit about myself, just to prove I'm a human being after all. Behind the scenes, so I'm married in Sydney, live in Sydney, although I sort of cohabit under more normal conditions between Sydney and Auckland, as most of our operations are centred there. We have an office both sides of the ditch, as it were, but obviously in recent months I haven't been doing that. 3 kids, 3 grandkids, and a dog. And started my career in, I've been around industry and major assets and infrastructure all my life, really. And I started life on the railroads, doing signaling and data systems, telecommunications, that sort of stuff. And then moved into manufacturing generally, and then process manufacturing in more recent times. Came to the Southern Hemisphere back in, I can't remember now, 94, something like that. And always had a passion for travel. And the last few years have been traveling extensively, assisting businesses, which is really great. some of the hobbies in the background, and the reason for putting these up is they kind of reflect my professional approach. So I'm one of these lunatics that stays out in the middle of the night looking through a telescope on the top of hills in dark places. And interestingly, that hobby's all about looking for the patterns in things, and that's exactly what happens when you're trying to advise businesses and understand what they're doing well and what they're not. I also fly light aircraft, and from a professional perspective, that's all about following proven processes and systems, and we certainly do that with our customers to make sure that we're not, any process or advice we give customers is all around proven systems and stuff that has worked many times before. And I also do a lot of walking in the bush, and I'm lucky to live up in the Blue Mountains above Sydney, and just a fantastic place to do bushwalking. But again, that's about back to basics, and that's really what we do with businesses, is try and unravel all the noise and take things back to the basics to take a holistic improvement approach. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to talk about, and the other thing is I'd encourage people to ask questions as we go through this. The more interactive this is, the more people will get out of it at the end of the day. And even if we don't get to the end of the presentation, it doesn't matter. It's more about the conversation. But what I was going to put up today were just 7 levers to consider through adversity that were the most common things we see in the market. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's certainly what we have seen the most of in recent months. When you look around the sort of pillars of business resistance from the stakeholders, the business front end, and all the business performance and all the things that make that hang together, they're just some of the things that we have seen and certainly see regularly. Now, I would say the things I'm pointing out here are things we see all the time. It's just the latest instability in the markets, I guess, has brought this into sharper focus and probably increased the pace of change somewhat. Okay, next slide, please. So the first consideration is around people, and interestingly, that might sound so obvious, but they go through this. If you think of the collective culture of an organization, they go through this sort of uncertainty and fear. The new state becomes normalized, and then we need to plan our way through that. And the last sort of state of mind, I guess, is how do we emerge stronger than we were before? And a lot of organizations are doing that already. And a lot of organizations that are struggling are the ones that get caught up in the change and I guess, divert from their strategy, getting a bit like being caught in the headlights, really, and totally caught up in the change that's required now and deflecting the business. And from a leadership perspective, it's about which, are you, is your glass half full or half empty? And the way that we have seen in the market, the way that the leaders of the business react to the change upon them absolutely steers the culture of the organization. So if there's a bit of panic at the top, that ripples down through the organization, and those companies don't fare so well through the change. And interestingly, the quicker you can get through this cycle, the better, obviously. And the more entrepreneurial the organization, the faster they move through this cycle. So we see small companies, privately owned companies, with an entrepreneur leading the business, they're at step 4 on day 2, whereas larger organizations are a lot slower. And again, if the leadership don't have a clear path, or at least are a guiding set of hands for everybody through the process, this is where we see organizations struggle. Not sure if there's any questions or comments around that. It's just it's a common thing that we see. I'm sure to people this sounds so obvious, but it's amazing how many companies actually are struggling to put the emphasis required on managing that collective consciousness of the organization through the process.
Peter, I've got a quick question on that. What are the key traits of successful businesses that have adapted quickly in the COVID-19 environment? Are there some common elements that they demonstrate or that they exercise?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, the leadership being in the sort of the glass half full camp, but really taking the time to spread that through the organization, those companies tend to fare quite well. And in actual fact, not only do they recover more quickly or find a stronger position more quickly, they actually weather the storm a lot better as well. So that's definitely one pattern we see. We also see companies that can adjust their strategy but stick to the main strategy, because you have to remember, of course, the world that formed the strategy in the first place is still there. It's been distorted or changed a bit more quickly. So companies that can keep that in mind and then make obviously some of the short-term changes that need to happen align with that strategy, they also fare better. Does that answer your question?
Appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so next slide, please. Second thing to consider is the market. And again, this probably sounds a bit obvious, but really have an X-ray view of what's gone on. So understand there's been a lot of change. I mean, one of the things we see generally is markets are speeding up, change is speeding up. It's known as the age of the customer, industrial 4.0, whatever you want to call it. Everybody is connected, your customers are connected and can buy from anywhere at any time, and organizations need to be much more responsive generally. And that requires a much deeper understanding, or certainly a more up-to-date understanding of your market than perhaps you could have got away with before. But then if you pile on top of that a pandemic situation where markets and companies are pivoting, then you've really got to understand what's happened to your market, what's happened to your customers' markets, and are there new opportunities, for instance, or are the disruptors in your market that weren't there before? And really understand what the customer's midterm aspirations are. Now, you know, Brendan, to circle back on the question you asked before, do we see any irregular patterns? We absolutely do, in as much that this is probably one of the most underestimated impacts of rapid change. And companies that have realized that and have delved back in and tested their strategy and tested their market and really done a fair bit of research are definitely faring better than those that don't, those that are assuming things haven't changed that much. Now, in some markets, of course, things haven't changed that much, but in other markets, things have changed significantly, and in other markets, you know, they've been impacted catastrophically. So there's quite a range here, but it's certainly one of the things that we have seen that are certainly catching people out.
Peter, in respect to that, is there a more increased usage of data analytics, or maybe venturing into AI applications to assist with this X-ray view?
Great question. Yes and no. There is an absolute need for it, but companies are slow on the uptake, and that has because there is a significant, or there has always needed to be a significant investment involved. Some of the BI platforms, it's a bit like the early ERP days when ERP systems were coming in, people were starting a resource plan across their value chain and connect up their systems. There weren't many players, and that investment was significant. BI is in a similar state at the moment. So there are, you know, some of the big players like Microsoft BI and Tableau, etc., and there's some lighter end solutions like ClickView, etc. But there are now people coming into the market that are offering BI platforms that open that up to a much wider band of organizations, and the SMEs can now start to invest in this and get the benefits. The requirement, though, Brendan, is absolutely there. So the whole cycle around business making, if you think back to a traditional business model where you set some targets over a year, you split that into quarters, and this year was last year plus 5%, and then you measure each month how you're doing on that. The problem is with that, markets are moving much quicker than that. So if you think of a monthly cycle, especially from a strategic perspective, so a board or an executive team are making decisions on data that's now 6 weeks old, assuming it takes a couple of weeks to compile the reports at the end of the cycle, that's way too slow. And the data's dead on arrival, and the market shifted. So the requirement to have real-time data makes get the business transparent, so the internal drivers are visible in some sort of board form, you know, with KPIs, etc., is absolutely critical. Now, what's happening is businesses are waking up to that, and of course, the larger organizations have been doing it for some time. What's not happened yet is the new players that are offering BI solutions at a much more competitive investment level. That's not well known in the market yet. So the sort of medium-sized enterprise and SME end of the market hasn't done that, sort of transferred out of that monthly cycle. And for them, the markets, they are able to be more flexible as they're smaller organizations, and their markets are moving even quicker. So it's kind of even more critical, but it's a really interesting question, and something that we have seen the last 12 months, and we've seen the last 4 months, that's probably doubled in speed. The change, just the speed that decisions need to be made from a strategic and operational perspective, that requirement has just about doubled in the last, certainly the last 6 months. Any other questions or comments around that? It is a pretty interesting situation, certainly with the amount of change that's going on. And it's also reflected, I guess, in the survey you just saw. Nearly everybody has seen change. Okay, next slide, please. One of the other things that we have seen, a tool that we've seen widely used by companies testing their strategies, is a thing called VUCA. And your audience might be conversant with this, but it was originally a tool that was brought out of the American forces, actually. But it's all around testing the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, and the ambiguity in a market. And it's a really useful test to use. Could we just move on to the next slide? There's a really easy way to do this, but it's a great way to test your strategy. So if you can test the volatility, what are the drivers, what are the effects, what are the demands for your market and your business, and the same for uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. It's a great test for a strategy, or it's a great way of flushing out at the higher level what may have changed in your market. We use this tool a lot with customers, but I mean, it's a widely available tool and is used across industry quite well. But we've seen a lot of companies take this up outside of anything we do. So I just thought I'd put it up here because it's a really useful test for your strategy, in a very clear way to get what the high level change levers have been in your markets and what's driving things. Any questions, comments? Move on. Okay, next slide, please. One of the common things we see is about having a clear growth and profit map over the next 3 years. What does your future, how well can you describe your business is going to look like in 3 years? Now, with the amount of change and the speed of change, this is more challenging than it ever was before. And in fact, if you look at the latest McKinsey research, for instance, they're saying, you know, don't worry about your strategy, worry about your available data and your dashboards. Make sure you're making quicker decision cycles. Of course, they don't mean that your strategy is not important. They just mean that there needs to be a stronger short-term focus along with your long-term direction. Now, what's interesting about this, before COVID came along, and I'm talking very generally here, but if you think of the 80-20 rule, think of the Pareto rule, about 80% of companies don't have a working 3-year position on their business. And that sounds amazing, I know, and it surprised us. all the years we've been doing this, it constantly surprises us how many companies of all sizes, so we're talking from Fortune 500 companies down to privately owned companies, don't have a longer term position that they're actively working on. Most companies will have some sort of future state that they have either thought about or have planned at some point, but having that very clearly described and measurable and linking back to things that are happening today that link directly to that, only about 20% of companies we see do that well. The other thing of note here is companies that work from the future back to now, rather than work now into the future, as it were, tend to run at, again, I'm generalizing here, but tend to run about double the speed of companies that are just working for today into the future, because it's that much more of a structured position. It's that much more well thought through from a process and systems perspective, that it creates that focused, faster acceleration as businesses move forward. So what are those long-term milestones? Can you describe them? More importantly, can you measure them? Does the execution plan directly link to them? Is that competitive landscape still understood? And of course, the slide I showed before, with the recent change, that's become even more in focus. But just in normal business, that's often a struggle for organizations. Having that a clear approach to the market, knowing these things and knowing where you're going and knowing how that links to today. And also the cycle that your current customer relationships are in regard to that. And I'm talking about, the Pareto customers, the 20% of customers that drive the 80% of the volume, as it were, the key customers. I've just had a question come up a second. A question here. I'm wondering how we know if the strategy is risk and safe through the VUCA self-analysis. Do we analyze each of the different risks and use another industry examples in order to convince that your strategy is safe or not safe? Great question. So, I mean, the short answer to that is this is more of an indicator tool, and you'd need to do, if this tells you that there are sensitive areas or things have changed or the demands might have changed from what you knew before, that obviously takes a deeper dive to understand how safe your strategy may or may not be. And benchmarking with other industries is always a great thing to do. So absolutely. But this is purely really an indicator to get you thinking about that stuff.
Peter, I've got a question just on your profit and growth map. Obviously, there's a shift in terms of maybe longer term strategy to shorter term. Is that changing the leadership type, the executive, how the executive is operating, and maybe the executive characteristics in organizations?
Great question. Let me think about that. It is changing the characteristics from the point of view executives are becoming more comfortable making decisions based on data. And that sounds crazy, surely everybody makes decisions on data, but they kind of don't from an executive collective perspective. A lot of decisions in business still get made on experience, history, gut feel, and on the smaller end of decisions are made on pure data. In actual fact, some of the business management tools that were brought in over time to try and change that model were things like Six Sigma that turn every business problem into a statistical problem, that you solve that statistical problem, then turn that back into a solution. And that was all about trying to drive from the executive down an approach to making business decisions based on data. What's really interesting now is that requirement has come because of the speed of change in markets. So from a change of characteristics, the executives that now are doing better are the ones that are comfortable making decisions on pure data. And I'm not suggesting for a moment you ignore history or ignore the people around you, or you ignore the culture of the organization or anything like that, but they are comfortable at making shorter term decisions on data that is changing more rapidly. And that doesn't suit the older management styles as well. And there are definitely changes we see at the executive level as a result of that. And that's in just about any business, by the way. I mean, we are heavily focused in the industrial space and the logistics and critical infrastructure space. A lot of our customers are in that sort of industrial arena, but we do, we touch companies in all markets, and that pattern of quick change and a requirement for data that can change quickly and an immediate requirement for that data is definitely changing the type of executive that's running that, if that makes sense to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Peter.
Just checking the Q&A box. So we've got no more questions here. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So supply chain, which will be everybody's topic here, I'm sure. Most people here will know this topic in and out, and it's a hugely complex topic, as everybody knows. It's a hugely powerful and complex discipline that touches every aspect of business. But here I've just listed some of the most common things that we have seen businesses struggle with. Certainly, well, they struggle with most of the time, but certainly in the last 6 months, these have become the most common things we've seen. So as markets change and as supply chains have been well and truly tested in the last 6 months, the first point, the lack of procurement controls, really come to the surface, especially in dynamic environments. Where we've seen this specifically be the case is in the construction space, where things on the ground can change quite quickly, conditions can change quite quickly, investments around construction projects around critical infrastructure can change quite quickly. And not having good controls around that procurement space drives a lot of cost into those projects that really doesn't need to be there, or certainly are not getting best price, or people not understanding how the procurement links to the the EOQ and the stuff around that. So really the first couple of points. Now we all know, and you would all know as supply chain professionals, organizations struggle with this stuff generally. There's no doubt about that, and hence why there are supply chain professionals in this world, and why ASCI is here and all the rest of it. Is this topic is so powerful and touches so many things. But lately we have seen this be tested really significantly, and where people don't have good control over this, or just don't understand the impact of not controlling a supply chain well, are really struggling at the moment and not doing as well as companies that have it under control. Now, Brendan, I'm sure you could have 100 questions around this stuff. Again, I'm trying to just explain the stuff that we see on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
Inventory. So, inventory management and the theories thereof. And I remember studying this when I did APIX, and, again, incredibly complex, but where we've found organizations that need to transfer inventory into cash quickly, and again, in the more dynamic environments and dynamic manufacturing environments, where they don't have this under control, they are being tested now more than ever. A comment here, our big aha moment was ROI and inventory, absolutely. And, we spend a fair bit of time working on supply chain with people. We have a couple of supply chain professionals in our organization that specialize in this space, and customers are always amazed at how much waste there is in their inventory processes. And of course, what makes this so powerful is it's cash, it's straight to the bottom line. So, anything that can be optimized in that inventory space obviously makes a bottom line impact. Hence what you know, MRP processes are all about, and bringing inventory in just before you need it and getting rid of it quickly. But in a dynamic environment, i.e. manufacturing, servicing a short demand cycle, or again, construction, where things may change on the ground and there's always some need to hold inventory around those projects at some level. When it's being tested like it is now and it's not well understood, this is really catching organizations out. The fourth point then, lack of velocity through poor forecasting. I mean, this must just ring a bell with just about everybody on this call, I would have thought, but this again has been tested severely in the last 6 months, where companies that have had poor forecasting, poor sales and operations planning or integrated business planning, whatever it may be, and that demand management is not well understood, when you start shaking the markets around and shaking the demand around from your customers, shaking the supply into your business, this poor forecasting absolutely is unraveling companies at the moment. And interesting, we're seeing this on a number of fronts. This is more relevant in Australia and New Zealand and less so in the UK and the US, amazingly. And I think that's more to do with the fact that the markets have been much, from a percentage perspective, have been interrupted a lot more in the Southern Hemisphere. You know, doing business in the US, even though they're struggling a lot more from a health perspective, you know, with COVID running right through the country, business itself is still going at high velocity, and it's almost as though you know, people are trying to make hay while they can. It's incredible, really. It's a very different view of the world. The Southern Hemisphere has been very much, let's stop and see what happens and hold our breath, and that interrupts markets deeply. And those people that are struggling with forecasting on under normal operations have really come unstuck. Another comment's just come up here. Absolutely. So relatively much longer lead times to get goods through. And this comes to the last point I'm going to talk about, but this has been another issue. So where we don't have resilience through the supply chain, or we're relying on stuff that's coming from other places that's got a longer lead time, or people have turned things off because their demand has been reduced and therefore suppliers that could supply you can't supply you, have absolutely impacted this whole process. If you then mix that up with with poor demand planning, if you like, you know, it's catastrophic. And we have seen a lot of companies have come unstuck through this. The other area that has challenged companies, where, and this is quite common in some of the manufacturing companies we've seen, certainly in the last 12 months, but sharpened again in the last 6 months, where their distribution of product isn't optimized anyway, with a disruptive demand pattern thrown into that. Again, it's turned into chaos and driven a lot of cost back into the logistics that's really doesn't need to be there with better planning. So again, it's just something that's come into sharp focus over the last 6 months. And then that brings us to the last point. So this lack of resilience, you know, it's a global supply chain out there. It still is. And it's not to say that you can't get product from other places, or you can't distribute your product to other places. It is slower, but it's certainly made a lot of people stop and think about, what's my plan B? What's my plan C? And companies that operate like that normally and have a bit of resilience built into their supply chain and have alternates have fared quite well through this chaos, especially companies that have thought about having local supply as well as offshore supply. Companies that haven't, which is the most common, have obviously been impacted. And although it's difficult to point to one thing, if you have a mixture of these 6 things going on, this is what's unraveling businesses of all sizes, but probably the larger organizations more than the smaller ones. Smaller ones can be a bit more nimble and react to things more quickly. The larger organizations, where all this stuff is not under control, are really getting caught out at the moment. How are we doing for time? Okay. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
I have a comment, I suppose, Peter, but you love your response on this. Obviously, the sort of the whole supply demand chaos in the last 6 months. Do you think that there's going to be some normalization that will come, or key learnings that businesses that have now been through a very rough time will implement quickly? Because if they don't, there's a grim future.
Yeah, great question. Look, I'll answer both parts of that. So will it normalize? Yes, it will. But I don't think the new normal will be the same as the old normal. And I think we'll take a while to get there, especially people that are exposed to a global supply chain. That normalization there is quite a long way off. As far as adapting to the new norm, again, companies that do that quickly and have the data to hand to do it and have good planning systems will fare better, and they will react quickly. Companies that have been struggling with all of this stuff anyway will be slower to react. And this comes back to the point you raised earlier, Brendan, around the demand for data. To have intelligence through your operations and the data to hand to make those decisions is more critical now than it's ever been. And again, I'm sure we will see BI platform, business intelligence platforms, get adopted more readily than ever before, and certainly the demand is far greater there than ever before. But the companies that don't change or try and keep going, thinking the new normal will return, I think will get unstuck. And at the end of the day, if you look at research, global research on the outcomes of a large global post downturn like this, there will be about 10% less businesses that survive. And if you think about that globally, that's a lot of businesses. Now, the flip side of that, of course, that's great news for the ones that do survive. But it is a significant amount of turmoil, and those ones that don't survive will be the people that can't adapt. I'm not sure if I answered your question or not there.
Thanks, Peter.
It's a big question you asked there, Brendan. There's a lot inside this, but certainly we are seeing it, and the guidance around that 10%, we are actually seeing that play out now. So, and again, it's not market specific, so I think that research is fairly sound. Next slide, please. So the other thing to think about here is getting a fresh perspective on your acceleration levers. And I'm not saying this because I'm a consultant, by the way, and you should hire me and get a fresh perspective. What I mean here is test your current perspective. Find some peers, look at other industries. Of course, we advocate getting professional help to do this sort of stuff, but it doesn't mean you have to have professional help to do it. Do what research you can, but try and get a really fresh view of what you think your front end acceleration levers are. Are there new growth opportunities? Have you got a good strategic sales process? And really understand from account management through pipeline management, through all the things that go into strategic sales, is that under control? The pipeline velocity, is it what it was? Is the pricing strategy you're using still relevant? Does it open up other opportunities for pricing and positioning? Are your account management processes that used to work for you, are they still going to work for you? What's going on? Understand that a bit more deeply. So really do try and get a fresh perspective at the front end, and obviously in the operational end, it's trying to get a fresh perspective on how can we actually do things differently than we did before? What can give us an operational or a financial advantage? That I've mentioned here, that visual decision data becomes critical. Even if it's, there's no investment in a BI platform per se, every business has data, and the one thing that is totally unique about any business is it's the business's own data. It's as individual as a fingerprint, and companies really do underestimate the value that can be drawn from their individual data. and how they can use that as their advantage. So really try and understand that and question yourselves, challenge the leaders in your organization. It's absolutely critical, because the people that do this well, the people that can gain that fresh percentage, are the people that come out of things like this in a much stronger position than they went in, open up into new markets, realize they can do things they can't. We've all heard the term pivot get used excessively over the last 6 months. Some companies do that very well, some don't. But the ones that can really take a fresh view of all of this are seen to be faring very well. In fact, we've seen some customers that have, in fact, I'd say the customer that we personally deal with, we have one of them that's had 300% growth in the last 6 months through changing a direction and taking on a market that they would probably not have done had this not happened, and then question what they're doing. So there can be very positive outcomes. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment that everyone can suddenly grow by 300%, but you know, this whole idea of gaining a fresh perspective, the power of it is really not understood a lot of the time. The last point here too, by the way, understanding the customer pulse. Again, it's probably more important, well, it's definitely more important now than ever before. And again, one of the things that we only see about 20% of companies do really well. So this isn't about having customer surveys or complex surveys into your customer base. This is understanding the pulse of the customer. What are they thinking? What do they think about you? What's your reputation across the market? How many snapshots do you take snapshots every quarter or whatever it may be? Do you really understand the pulse of what's going on out there? We see most companies do not do that well. And right now it's critical, absolutely critical. Any comments, thoughts?
Peter, I have a quick question. Have you seen, obviously with COVID-19 and people being more domestically or home-based, has there been an upshift in ecom across most of the businesses that you would work with, or from observations across markets?
Definitely. For those markets and those companies that can adapt and do business that way, there has been a huge uptake. Not just e-commerce per se. One of the things that we've seen, and in fact it's affected us as a company, is the requirement has probably trebled in the requirement to do things remotely, and for obvious reasons. More so in the countries that have spent more time locked down than others has driven that need. But what has surprised us is the ability of companies to adapt to that. And I'm not just talking about doing business over Zoom like we're doing today. I'm talking about the fact that people can deliver services remotely that they couldn't before. So especially professional services organizations, people that are delivering services to customers where they would have once gone to the customers to do that, as it were, they're now finding ways to do that remotely. Equally, people that deliver services at multiple levels, and even products in doing that remotely and finding remote ways to do that business is at least trebled. So, and e-commerce is just part of that.
Thanks, Peter.
Last slide, please. So another thing where we've seen companies becoming unstuck over the last 6 months, and this is a challenge generally, I know, but this whole idea around leadership momentum, getting strategic momentum, and as I've said before, people having actions today that are clearly linked to a very clear 3-year position are the minority already. The companies that do that well have this sort of strategic momentum going on. The companies that don't get by, don't get me wrong, it's not like if you don't have strategic momentum, you're not going to be able to trade anymore. But when the environment around you becomes as dynamic as it is at the moment, this is something that's really catching people out. And what happens when it becomes fragmented? The executive becomes fragmented, and that includes the board, I might add. One of the other areas we've seen is people's interaction with the board. And I've talked to many CEOs with even less hair than me. I've been dealing with boards, and the way they've had to deal with the board has completely changed because the board's required shorter term information. They're wanting to be involved in change more readily than they would have been before. And so that whole executive dynamic is changing. And that's starting to get fractured alignment. So all of a sudden, what was a united front in an executive team, if you like, isn't so united anymore. And there's maybe as some of the point you raised before, Brendan, about the fact that some of the skill sets have changed at that executive level might be driving some of that also. We really haven't had time, long enough time to see the patterns and all of that. But we're definitely seeing that having alignment at the board level, at the executive level, at the P&L level requires a lot more effort than it ever did before. And that leads to the next point around communication. And we all know that all companies struggle with communication. Some do it brilliantly, most don't. But the requirement for communication at all the business levels has at least quadrupled in the last 6 months, especially as we think back to the comments I was making earlier around driving the culture through adversity. The requirement for multi-level communication at least quadrupled. It's probably more than that. And what we're seeing is the companies that just keep communicating the way they've always communicated, it's simply not adequate anymore, nowhere near adequate. And they are some of the companies that aren't faring so well with the change. The last point, again, is something that under normal operating conditions is still only the 20 percentile. And that is, we've got this great plan, we've got an execution plan, we're all aligned, we know where we're going, and we review it on a regular basis. And it's like any other plan, like an account management plan, like a plan through a supply chain, like demand management. The plans themselves are absolutely useless if you don't review them. Again, a common thing we see under normal conditions is businesses do a plan, gets put in the top drawer, doesn't get reviewed. We all know, we've all been there, we've all seen it. Right now, it is critical that people are reviewing what's going on, tying it to all the things I've mentioned before, because there is so much change out there at the moment. That review cycle is really, really important. Any comments, questions, thoughts? Brendan, this must be something you see a lot yourself, you know? I mean, it's
yeah, absolutely. I think the communication piece you referred to, I think has become, what I've noted has certainly be given that people have worked more remotely in the past months, the need for communication has become more and more critical for people to be engaged, because if they may feel physically distanced from their businesses.
Absolutely.
So that engagement, be it from team meetings and updates and having weekly forums around that and just check-ins is really important. And then I think the other point that you've raised I wasn't quite aware of is that the board becoming more engaged, you know, almost a bit more operational in some of the decision making, simply because things are changing that quickly that it's not quarterly or 6 monthly anymore. It's almost needs to be more interim than that.
Interestingly, that's happening more in the larger organizations than the smaller ones. And you know, you asked the question right at the beginning, Brendan, is there a need for more data around this stuff? One of the frustrations that we have seen is boards getting frustrated with the fact that data is not current enough, and it's not anybody's fault inside the organization. There just isn't the capability to generate the data required fast enough, you know. So yeah, boards are definitely getting more operational. And quarterly board meetings are, you know, most boards are meeting monthly at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a note there around IBP,
yeah,
Peter.
Just gonna read that out. So great comment here. So strategic plan review ideally should be part of IPB. Absolutely, it should. And that obviously the IPB monthly cycle. But then ask me how many people do IPB well. You know, again, maybe 20% of companies, probably less than that, probably 10%. So absolutely should be part of that cycle. And if you're running a good IPP cycle, that should all be happening. But does it happen? More often not than happen well, you know. Some good comments here today. Any other comments or thoughts? Okay, next slide, please. As we just sort of wrap this up, one of the things, and if anybody wants to ask me any questions around what I've presented today, please go through Brendan. People can contact me by email, ask any questions they like. On our website, we have a couple of tools there that people can use. One of them is we've got a complimentary Survive and Thrive toolkit where you can go and download, and it'll ask, there's about, I can't remember offhand, 70 or 100 questions in there. So, and it will score you, you can score yourself about how well you're doing some of this stuff, just as a thought provoker for your organization. We also have a growth and profit tool where people can self-assess some of the major disciplines. And again, if anyone want a copy of that, please just contact Brendan and he can let me know. You can have as many copies as you need. Not a problem at all. You might find the tool useful. If you don't, give us some feedback on that too. We've had a lot of people use it, but it's really just to help cement thoughts around this stuff. Okay, last slide, please. Just also, one of the things I discussed with Brendan, we've got a book out. I wrote a book and released it into the market a couple of years back, and we don't sort of promote it extensively. But what I have said to Brendan, if people, as part of working with ASCI, if people want a copy of the book, just go to that website and order it. It's free of charge. The team will send it out in the post. All you need to do really is go online and give us a postal address, and the team will send one out to you. We're happy to do it for any of the people that have attended today, and for any of the ASCI members. So it's really just trying to give a bit of benefit back to Brendan and the team, and the association.
Thank you, Peter.
If there's any other questions, you know, that's really trying to give, I know it's all been very high level, but you know, there's a lot of stuff to try and cover off in 40 minutes or whatever. But I guess the message out there is beware of the change. It's driving a lot of chaos out there, and people that don't have the good planning systems. And I'm sure all the supply chain professionals that are listening to this today, it's old hat. They know, they absolutely know that, and they've been driving the frustration of not getting good planning through their organization for years, but it's becoming more and more of a problem. And that having that accurate data and having it real time is becoming more and more of an issue. Again, any questions or comments, please feel free. Brendan can contact me. People can have my email address, whatever helps. I'm happy to help people.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to everyone who participated and engaged today. Certainly feel free to contact me or through Monique at ASCI as well. We're happy to follow up on this, and look forward to people tuning in on the next webinar next week. But hopefully it's been valuable for everyone. Definitely great insights shared by Peter, so really appreciate your expertise and contribution to the whole forum today. Hopefully we walk away with a few more tools, and being able to apply those in our real environments. Thank you, and I'll call the webinar to a close at this point. Again, appreciate all of your support.
Brendan, I'm happy for you to share my email address with people if it helps. If people want to ask questions directly, no problem at all.
Absolutely. So if anybody wants to connect with me, people can do so perhaps on LinkedIn or through Monique as well. It doesn't matter. So happy to share what any requests people might have, or for any follow-up or Q&A that comes out of today's topic. So thank you, everyone. I will draw it to now conclusion. We're sharp on 2 p.m. and appreciate your attendance and contributions. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.